Well, welcome to this video, and I hope you like it. If you do, click the like button, hit subscribe, and share with a friend. Okay, first part in probably at least a 7 or 8 part series, because there are multiple topics that I'd like to cover here, but this has to do with GMO crops, not just GMO technology, but specific GMO crops. I had mentioned that in a previous rant, and somebody kind of seemed to want to go deeper, so I thought to myself, well, I'll sit here and cover things one topic at a time. I can't go in depth on these individual items all together in one video. The damn thing would be 6 hours long. I want to go through individually the pros stated by the GMO seed industry and the cons listed by their critics, and just go through each one of these things individually in more depth. However, disclaimer, there's a limit to how much depth I can go in a reasonable amount of time. So, the thing I'd like to cover today is the concept of we've been genetically modifying crop seeds since the beginning of time. That's really a stretch. As technology advances, so does our knowledge of things on a cellular level. I mean, once upon a time it was animal, vegetable, and mineral, and they lumped, bacteria and fungus in with plants because morphologically they thought they were closer to a tree than they were to something animate like a bird or a fish or a mammal, which obviously gets lumped into animals. So, they had that simplified view of the world. It's like a plant is something that grows, but it can't get up and walk or swim or fly. A little bit farther into looking at things under a microscope, and even just morphology to some extent, green plants are probably closer to animals than they are to, say, a fungus. Just the way they interact, the way they sexually reproduce, and everything else. I mean, when you compare the sexual reproduction in animals to the sexual reproduction in green plants, pollen is basically the equivalent of sperm, and the seed is the egg. That's growing and hatching something. An acorn is an oak egg that hatches into an oak tree. But not to go too far off topic there, as we get a little bit farther along and they look a little bit more at how cells function internally, they've actually divided the world into eukaryotes and prokaryotes. Prokaryotes contain bacteria and a couple other odd things that were considered primitive cells called archaea. So those are kind of lumped into one big branch of all living things, and the other big branch is eukaryotes. So notice that while back in the day they probably would have thought bacteria are a type of plant, now they're basically saying, everything from human beings to ferns to fish to amoebas are all eukaryotes, and bacteria are something different. All your multi-celled organisms are eukaryotes. The way 20 years ago now, when I was going through microbiology, the way it was explained to me is eukaryotes are physically complex. You know, they develop into complex or multicellular organisms. They are complex in that way. Whereas prokaryotes are chemically complex. You know, they're the things that they figure out how to, you know, use sulfur instead of oxygen, or you know, other things, living down around thermal vents and you know, most of your things that are designed to have an alternate metabolism that can break down hazardous waste or something, it's all going to fall into the prokaryotes, primarily bacteria. You know, they just have a lot more ways of metabolizing things, and that's how they tend to adapt their cellular processes to the world, whereas eukaryotes tend to develop their more physical processes to the world. So, you know, that's the big division in biology, in modern biology, is prokaryotes, eukaryotes. Among the prokaryotes, there is some gene transfer that happens naturally. That's one of the things these complex little bacteria tend to do. They have several ways that they do this gene transfer. One is called conjunction, where two unrelated bacteria somehow give each other a little signal, and they send a little tube across between their cell walls, and they just exchange little pieces of DNA with each other. That's how they mutate and diversify over time. They don't even have to be closely related in a lot of cases. Another thing is called transformation, where a bacteria is cruising along and just finds a random piece of DNA floating around from, you know, a cell that deteriorated or whatever, and just claims it out of the environment and tries to do something with it. The last one is called transduction. Sorry, I'm peeking around my my tripod because the whiteboard that I wrote this stuff on is on the other side. I just got a little outline with a couple of notes. Yeah, transduction is yeah, I got that right. Is when there's accidental gene transfer, usually from a virus invading a cell, be it a bacteria, eukaryote, whatever. But viruses are kind of a unique thing because they're smaller than a cell. They cannot reproduce themselves, but they contain DNA, and they kind of get inside cells and con that cell into reproducing them. That's how they function. Then there's the other isolated case of gene transfer. So the only thing I really know of that crosses over into the eukaryotes in any appreciable way, and it's where bacteria infect plants, primarily trees. And sometimes you'll see a tree in the woods and it'll have like this canker on it, like tree cancer, for lack of a better way of putting it. But it's caused by a bacterial infection that gets in there, and it actually puts a little piece of DNA in the tree's cells that make the tree produce nutrients that feed that bacteria, and it'll create like a little tumor on the tree. So it's a tumor forming sort of defect there. But that's pretty much the main gene transfer between cells. I mean, you have certain things that cause cancer. Some cancers are caused by viruses or bacterial infections, causing some sort of genetic defect in the cells, which creates the cancer. I wouldn't consider that quite being the same road as, you know, gene splicing. So that's why I don't want to just get the feeling somebody's going to bring up like human papilloma virus or something, and it's like, I'm not, that's a little too far afield. But then to say that we've been doing this throughout human history is false. Remember that big division between eukaryotes and prokaryotes. We don't farm bacteria. We farm primarily green plants and some animals, if you want to include livestock in there. And we should, because they're making GMO salmon and Lord knows what else now. But, you know, the main way that we have genetically altered crops over the years is just selection. In wild trees, I'm going to pick a mulberry tree for an example. There's red mulberries are native here. The white mulberries are alien, but that's another story. But just red mulberries, you know, most of them have fairly small fruit. They don't taste bad, but there's a wide range in the flavors. So a lot of them are nothing to write home about, but some of them are really, really good tasting. And it's kind of all over the map. It's hit and miss. Some of it's the soil it's growing in, and some of it's genetics. So, say you find a tree that has big berries. You know, some of them have berries like the size of your thumb. Most of them not nearly that size. So you find one that has nice big berries. Not the greatest flavor, but it has big berries. So you like having the bigger berries. So, say you plant berries from that tree, and every time a tree grows from the seeds you plant, you select out of those because, you know, its genes are mixed with whatever other trees it cross-pollinated with. You just select the ones that also have big berries. Now you can also add in maybe, okay, I'm going to selectively cross-pollinate this myself. You find one that's got really sweet berries, you find one that's got really big berries. And you're like, okay, I'm going to take some pollen from one tree and put it on the flowers of the other. And that way I'm trying to get offspring that are both large and sweet. And then you keep on selecting the same way out of those offspring, the sweetest and the largest, and so on till you get larger, sweeter berries. That's how we have, you know, apples that are bigger than the ancestral apple trees have in Central Asia. You know, they selected them for different qualities. Unfortunately now most of your apples are selected for you know, surviving long distance transportation and a long time without going bad more than size or flavor. But I digress. And the third thing, between just selection and selective crossbreeding to augment that, you can hybridize things that don't necessarily naturally hybridize. I mean, some things hybridize on their own. Oak trees would be a good example of that. That's one of the things that makes them maddening to try to identify in the field, because you can have characteristics of more than one species because they naturally mix and match. A lot of times hybrids have a random proportion of genes one way or the other when they're fairly fluid in being able to hybridize. In other cases, hybrids are sterile and never reproduce themselves, so you never really get a shift past like a 50-50 mix of genes, although which particular genes you get from which parent can be kind of a random and shift things around. So you can get some variation that way, and you can try to, you know, if it can reproduce, you can create more or less an artificial species that share select characteristics of either one. That's how we get some of our citrus fruit. Some of our citrus fruit are actually different citrus species crossbred with each other. And a well-known sterile hybrid is a mule. You cross a horse with a donkey, you get a mule. But with hybridization, there's a limit. Usually things have to be in the same genus or a very closely related genus. You can't go too far afield. Oak trees, readily hybridize with each other to a large extent. Just naturally in the wild they do that. However, oak trees are related to both chestnuts and beech trees, and you'd be really hard pressed to create a hybrid between an oak and a chestnut. Sometimes people manage to do some really creative things. Sometimes people stretch things by, collecting pollen from a plant and storing it in the freezer and then using it to pollinate a plant that wouldn't even be blooming at the same time. There's some stretches that people do there, but there's a limit. Like I said, you can cross a horse and a donkey and get a mule. You can't cross a horse and a wolf and get a wolf horse. There's a limit. Now, getting back to the GMO crops and their claim that, this is the same as something we've been doing for years. Remember, all of the modification that people have historically been doing is either selecting what they, preferred traits within a population of a given species, or possibly hybridizing two related species. You can't really go farther afield than that. So, like I said, you can cross a dog with a wolf. You can cross a donkey with a horse. You can't go very far outside of that. One of the most common GMO crops is your BT crops. BT stands for Bacillum thuringiensis, which is a bacteria that produces a natural insecticide. So you're building the insecticide into the crop by crossing it with a bacteria. And going back to the beginning, eukaryote, prokaryote. That bacteria has as much in common with any green plant as, actually it has less in common with any green plant than that green plant has with a human being. There is more in common between a human being and sphagnum moss than there is between a bacteria and, say, corn or soybeans. So you have to keep that in mind. It's very much an exaggeration. Genetic modification by selective breeding and or hybridization or some combination of the two is, a light year away from selectively taking DNA from a bacteria and putting it in a plant or an animal. It's just, it's light years away. I mean, it's like the difference between sending people to the moon and sending people to another solar system with intelligent life, light years away. It's an immense jump. It's not the next little baby step. It's a huge jump. And with it being a huge jump, there are more unknowns as far as long-term ramifications. I'm not saying there necessarily are any, I'm just saying it's unknown. If you say it is known, you are lying because it can't be known. It's an unprecedented, circumstance. It's kind of like the people who, they invent some new product and say it's going to last for 100 years. Well, if it's only existed for 6 months, how the hell you know what condition it's going to be in 100 years from now? It's an educated guess at best, and just idle speculation at worst. It's new technology. It's a very new thing. So just wanted to cover that one thing. Some of the things coming up is the next one I've already started working on, I got to finalize, is, you know, the whole thing about feeding the world. That's one of the supposed pros, which is easy to debunk. Another one is it being environmentally friendly because it's better than some of the other things that farmers are doing, which I also plan to debunk. And you know, we'll take it from there. I'm like I said, I'm going down the list, kind of one topic at a time. So you know, I'd love to get some comments and some feedback on this, but you know, just keep in mind that some of these other topics I'm going to cover in the future, so I don't want it to go too far astray. I just want, you know, stay focused on one thing. So hopefully this kind of explains and kind of I guess I want to say debunk. I mean, we have been modifying things genetically, but in a far different way, and it's a real misleading statement to say that, hey, we've been genetically modifying things for thousands of years, so this is no different. No, this is very different. So going to leave it there, and see you on the next one. Well, I hope you found that video informative. Hopefully it made you think, and please click the like button and subscribe if you haven't done that already, and check out the video that should be appearing somewhere around me here, and I hope to see you on the next one. Thanks.